in a committee to try and figure out what the carve-outs ought to be and what the rate is, and to just come up with a better solution, how long would it take for a group of like professionals to come up with an alternative? Would they be in a room with pizza and soda for 5 days? Would it happen in 2 days? Would it be months? Years? What's your best guesstimate of that? What would it take to really think it through and project it out logically?
I would err on the side of a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
This question was posed to us. I've presented on the subject of tax reform along with a couple of board members, Jim O'Neill and Helen Hecht, in the last couple of years. What Jim and I suggested at the beginning of this year was they were interested in the Sher-Taylor proposal. The answer seemed to be it's a non-starter if the rate is too high and the base isn't big enough. But otherwise, it could be worthy of further study. If not, you have that fork in the road, and perhaps we start talking about, instead of broadening the base, having a more normal sales tax, which is going to be a little narrower base, which would be more in exemptions and deductions, but not in a bad way necessarily. But that process has sort of begun. Council Service had some money, and they've let that contract to BBER to do the base study. Step 2, the results of that should be available in November. This November. And the notion is it will be presented to the Interim Revenue Stabilization and Tax Policy Committee. That's not politically sensitive, right? That can happen before or after the election, doesn't matter, because no one has to do anything with that information. We're not talking about, taxing babies or anything like that. But after that is when you start going down that path. And part of the other conversations that I've heard or been a part of is, I mentioned the trend of having failed tax reform commissions. I staffed the Blue Ribbon Tax Reform Commission. I was on the Budget Balancing Task Force. Prior to those, there was the Professional Tax Study Committee, none of which had the buy-in and support that they needed. Some I likened to a traveling circus. Blue Ribbon, if it's amusing to see the Girl Scouts pack the Senate Finance Committee chambers because they were worried that cookies were going to get taxed because nonprofits were being looked at. And even more ironic was all the wrong nonprofits showed up because it was the service-providing nonprofits that were in the crosshairs, not the Girl Scouts. But that's the kind of thing that can derail any kind of an effort and make politicians squeamish. So the right answer is probably, even though it's not 1968 anymore, or 1964 when they started, the answer is probably find some professionals, some of the folks that you were talking about, bury them in a basement. As long as you don't have politicians involved, you're not violating Public Meetings Act. And it's not to keep anything a secret, but it's to allow ideas to percolate and vet before the lobbyists get involved. And so I think you need a year of that sort of thing, and you need some people to come back with some options and alternatives and well thought through ideas. It doesn't have to be a final draft per se of any one thing. In fact, I don't know that everyone has to agree on any one thing, but I can give you options. Again, we have a gross receipts tax instead of corporate income tax. We can do this, we can do that. But depending on how the scope of the change that you're trying to affect, and again, some people, my operating thesis is kind of just, try to be normal, don't be weird. And if that's all you're trying to do, that's one thing. If you're trying to raise an extra $2 billion, that's quite another. If you're trying to cut taxes in the process, that's another political debate. But my predisposition anyway, my starting point is to just be a little more normal and have a fairly level playing field, and then compete on our other strengths and weaknesses that we have plenty of, and also need focus, and that's part of the competing agenda. Education is important. There's never enough funding for schools. There's never enough funding for the homeless. There's never enough funding for anything, and so everything's competing, and that makes the conversation very, very interesting. But I think you could get the smart people in the room. I think the process would be to come up with a good idea, get buy-in and some participation perhaps from all of the interested stakeholders. Whether you're worried about vulnerable households and regressivity, because our gross receipts tax is very regressive, all sales taxes are, and that means, and that's why we have people trying to carve out some of the consumption bases, and that's not the way to handle regressivity, because then pyramiding just whacks everyone back. But those interests are there. You're going to have business interests. If I'm a CPA and you want to get rid of the tax on CPAs, I'm all for it. That's great. But if I'm a doc and I got a deduction today that I didn't have 10 years ago, and now you want to take it away, well, maybe that's a different conversation. So I think you'd have to get a lot of buy-in. I think you'd have to have a spirit of camaraderie, somewhat. Maybe that's the wrong way to phrase it, but you'd have to have some bipartisan support, and I think you could do that. Our legislature, the question about who would you involve, I believe outside experts would be useful at some point as well.
Out of state?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That would be controversial, out of state contract or something, I don't know, but it's...
Well, but what you end up with out of state experts is you get an objective viewpoint. It's almost like, why would you let the policeman right next door to you negotiate the policeman's union contract? Well, of course, you want your local neighbor to have the best deal possible, but would that negotiation be better if it was done by somebody that was coming from Connecticut or Ohio and had a more objective viewpoint and didn't live next door to you?
Right.
Would the negotiation be more business,
mm-hmm.
fiscally responsible type negotiation?
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought it would be.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying the same thing. Some outside experts would be a good thing in this because they don't have an axe to grind and they don't have a mouth to feed.
Right.
They just want to look at the numbers and crunch them, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. Council Service asked Jim O'Neill and myself to sniff around and find someone who could do this initial base study for us. And in that process, we were thinking about folks that might help down the road if it ever comes to that. And we talked to the Tax Policy Center, which is an Urban Brookings joint venture. We talked to the Tax Foundation. We talked to BBER. As it turns out, for what we're trying to do here for the money, that's by far the best deal. But down the road, and some others, Ernst & Young, at some point would probably give a couple other, there's a couple of policy schools that focus on this type of thing. E&Y for sure, because they have a captive practice that focuses on state stuff. D&T very well might, as might KPMG. And I should mention PwC too, to be politically correct, if we want to get all four. So there are groups out there, but also I'm trying to think of there's policy schools in Georgia and Tennessee that focus on this stuff. But they all have different strengths and weaknesses and different costs and different bandwidths. And at this juncture, it was appropriate to hire our local group to try to just figure out the size of this base. But down the road, not only do you want policy input on the policy implications, perhaps, of your proposals, whether it's social policy or business competitiveness, whatever, but also for modeling, because again, if we do go down the path of reform, you can't get the numbers wrong, and if you do, you have to have ways to remedy the situation. So you might do some sort of phase in that you can stop if the revenue is too much or too little, or that sort of thing. I think it was Joe Henchman of the Tax Foundation told me they were helping, I think it was North Carolina, with some reform, and they were modeling the sales tax base, and I guess they used 3 different independent groups. And they all got fairly close, which gives you some sense of comfort. It doesn't mean that they all got it right. They might have all got it wrong, but I think that sort of approach, depending on the circumstances, makes a lot of sense. And if you can get groups, some of the groups I mentioned have different orientations and leans, if you will, and I think that's a healthy thing too. You had prefaced, I think, in the interview, have I seen something happen in another state that really made sense? And I don't follow every state as closely as I should. There were several efforts in the last couple of years. But just to note one or two, Bobby Jindal proposed some tax reform in Louisiana. It was inevitably killed by the business community. He wanted to get rid of personal income taxes, which there are some groups that are very focused on. And the way he was going to do it was to expand the sales tax base. And normally that's fine, since most sales tax bases are limited to tangibles, and most economies are much more than tangibles now. But he wasn't limiting it to final consumption, so he was creating the pyramiding that we have. And people actually snapped to that, and that's what killed that proposal. They didn't think through that piece of it. So base broadening is good to an extent, but if you're going to have a sales tax versus gross receipts tax, you don't broaden your base into B2B transactions. It's an unhealthy approach.
Well, and to address that, it was the pyramiding that we do have that stopped his ability to reform the Louisiana taxes. It was pyramiding. So universally, it's not looked at kindly.
No.
Okay.
No, the other conversation we can never have is value-added taxes, right? Because that's a weird European thing. A value-added tax is simply a sales tax that's administered differently, that doesn't pyramid if properly designed. But I think it's impractical, again, that why be different thing. If the United States ever had a value-added tax, then what they call subnational VATs at the state level, like you see in Canada at the province level, would make a lot of sense. And when Canada married their tax programs, they actually got significant economic efficiency out of it. A lot of politicians also got voted out of office, because this thing with pyramiding is you don't see it. These VATs seem to have high rates because the pyramiding isn't there. It's just in that last rate. So you see a 14% rate, you see, oh my God, right? That's ridiculous. But under the current regime, we might be paying more than that, but we only see the 7.
Right. It's just like yachts and sailboats had a VAT tax imposed on it 5-6 years ago, maybe a little longer, of 10%. Now that was a huge thing, and it virtually stopped the yachting and boating industry on vessels that were over $150,000. Whatever that threshold was, it was relatively low, and it was an automatic 10% on top of it.
And that's in part because they didn't fix all the other things that go into the business of building boats. So it's different when you're in, Singapore probably has one of the better VATs and the more modern VATs. But until the nation goes that way, I don't think that's a viable conversation. Michigan's changed their corporate regime to include what used to be kind of a VAT several times, and it's bipolar, and it's reeks of desperation. And predictability is important. People forget how important tax administration is, and we're a small state with a unique tax code, underfunded tax department with lots of turnover, and it's very hard to just even give you the same answer this year that we gave you 2 years ago. And that's something that businesses abhor as well, and it's a challenge for any small state, especially when you're as unique as we are with our GRT.
In my very last business, it was 3 calls to the state in a 2-week period, 3 different people, 3 different answers on the same problem. Is this taxable or is it not? Is all of it taxable or part of it? And nobody could figure it out. It didn't seem very complicated a question, but we got 3 very distinctly different answers. And we were paranoid. Do we just collect it and pay it, or suffer the consequences, or go with the first person we got an answer from? It was a huge problem for us.
And it's a problem for businesses. We have these unresolved issues in the area of temporary services I was mentioning earlier, and when is it temporary, when is it not? And we've provided no guidance since the last court case, which also provided no guidance. We could. The problem is we have businesses, some that aren't even aware of it, and they're not paying it, and they're hugely competitively advantaged towards those that are gun-shy, and naturally so, and more inclined to just pay it. If your competitor's not, that's a problem. And what's the right answer? Well, figure out what your policy is, give sufficient guidance, and then hopefully everyone, and then audit, enforce, but consistently, and then everyone gets on the same page. Ideally, that's what you want. And the problem that you just described does happen, and it happens anywhere. It's not, it could happen with the IRS, but our stuff is, again, it's weird enough, and our agencies are small enough, and they've had enough turnover. That's a problem too, and I think part of tax reform might be how to help better administer the taxes, or help the agencies that are charged with it, and that's just another moving part that very few people have any appreciation for, but it's critical. It matters. The other tax reform effort I was going to mention, because there were a whole bunch of them in the last couple of years. D.C., the District of Columbia, had a tax reform, and it was very ironic. It wasn't super broad sweeping, but they applied some fairly long-held principles. They had committees that met for a while, and at the end of the day, they proposed broadening their sales tax to include consumption services as appropriate, and then they had some other things to help in different directions with businesses and poor. But it was legitimate reform, not on a super large scale basis. Who do you think complained? Instead of a tortilla tax, they had a yoga tax. The health clubs, the high-end health clubs in DC that all the young staffers go to. How can you tax health? How are you going to put a sales tax? And because of it, the mayor vetoed it.
The whole bill.
The whole bill. They didn't do a carve out for the yoga instructors or the health clubs, but it was we're calling it a yoga tax, and and that was the soundbite. How can you tax health? How can you well, if you're going to tax consumption, you tax all consumption. That's just what you do, and then you worry about regressive effects, or you worry about other effects later in other ways. But because you can do that with everything, right? That's when you cherry pick. But that's the challenge when you're trying to broaden a base and pull some things in, or you end up with those. Well, what do you have against poor people? What do you have against, in this case, yoga instructors? I got nothing against yoga instructors, but that's how that conversation falls to a first grade level. And politically, it can work, and that's why people are squeamish. Now, this story has an interesting ending. The mayor's veto was overridden by the council, and leading the charge were two different groups. I mentioned the Tax Foundation earlier, and the CBPP, the Center for Business. The Tax Foundation and the CBPP are not usually on the same team, if you know what I mean. The CBPP worries about households and poor people, usually not viewed as highly pro-business other than advocating for education and things that would later, whereas the Tax Foundation is more of a minimize taxes kind of an organization, but we all adhere to some of the same tax policy principles, and broadening the consumption base of your consumption tax is one of the things that they both agreed on, because they were doing other things that made sense. Maybe not in a vacuum. I don't think the CBP would say, well, just put a 20% tax on something that only poor people buy. No, they wouldn't agree with that. So they were both basically ginning up their own bases, very different ones, to overcome this yoga tax argument. And it's kind of ironic, whenever you see disparate groups like that on the same page, you ought to pay more attention. The academics are not nearly as far apart on a lot of issues as the partisans are. And I always find that a lot more interesting too. Usually any good debate, there's a legitimate kernel at least of an argument on both sides, and to fail to acknowledge one is just, in my view, to look stupid.
Point, counterpoint.
But it's I mentioned the tax increase that we had when we did the hold harmless and the food and medical back at that time, kind of the local equivalents, and maybe not really, but of the Tax Foundation, the CBPP, Voices for Children, and the Association of Commerce and Industry, both jointly published articles saying this is a bad idea, and this is why. it didn't matter. At the end of the day, they were the only two. The governor was a very persuasive individual, and you know, he got his way. And but it was interesting, you know, when I see, okay, who just wrote that? You know, you should stop and think, because there's a reason and again, you know, at policy levels, the wonks aren't nearly as far apart as the partisans in many cases. They can find a lot of areas of agreement, and but it's an interesting story. So that, you know, Washington actually did it, D.C. actually did it, but it took a, you know, what you might flippantly refer to as a right-wing group and a left-wing group to make it happen. So it can be done.
It can be done.
And our legislators, I know personally, they want to do the right thing by and large. There's a few bad apples out there, but they don't know what the right thing is. They're politically susceptible. They have, you know, they have their own knee-jerk reactions. They're a citizen legislature, so, you know, they're not all experts in any one of these fields that we're talking about. So they're like the average citizen on the street. They respond emotionally to some things, but they want the right things. But I think they need the cover, you know, to do the right things sometimes.